The conference very much came about because of the nature of the work at the National Cannabis Prevention and Information Centre. What sets it apart from other centres is that it brings together not just psychologists, mental health workers, but also we work across the board. We look at education, Indigenous issues, criminal justice. What we hope to achieve is to bring together a wide variety of perspectives on cannabis, from health, general health, mental health, from criminal justice, education and Indigenous issues, so we can talk together and share our experiences, our research knowledge, where our thinking is going in future directions, to see where the commonalities, what we can learn from each other that can be applied immediately, but also how we might work together in the future to develop new programs of research and interventions.
Well, I think the most important issue around cannabis at present is really understanding the association between cannabis and schizophrenia. Now, some claim that this association has been overstated, and it's true that the development of schizophrenia is a relatively rare occurrence among cannabis users. But nevertheless, it's a devastating disorder that really shatters the lives of the affected individual and their family members. We know that the peak period for the onset of schizophrenia is between adolescence and young adulthood, which is precisely the same period of peak use of cannabis. And we've shown that in people who are not necessarily vulnerable to the development of schizophrenia, they nevertheless develop memory problems, other kinds of cognitive deficits, changes to the function and structure of the brain, and they develop subclinical psychotic symptoms if they use cannabis heavily and for many years. And we know that adolescents are probably more vulnerable to these adverse effects of cannabis. I think over the past 10 years, the most significant developments have been in understanding the endogenous cannabinoid system and its role in the brain. So we know that it's critical for regulating cognitive processes, regulating neurotransmitter systems in the brain, but we still know very little about how long-term cannabis use actually impacts upon this system. I really think we really need to understand this association better to protect young people from developing the disorder.
Well, I guess I come to this conference as maybe someone who's a little bit different, in as much as I'm a neuroscience buff and I'm a guy in a white coat looking down a microscope. So undoubtedly the most interesting thing in my side of the business is our understanding of the endocannabinoid system of the brain. By endocannabinoids, we mean the brain's own cannabis. So if you were to summarize that role, perhaps the most important thing we do is protect the brain. So they have the ability to dampen down excessive electrical activity in the brain, to regulate processes. They're like a nurturing chemical medium for the brain, which is really quite interesting. There's something about the interaction between cannabis and the adolescent brain that I think is very important to understand with reference to the health of our young people. Certainly, we know that the earlier teenagers start using cannabis, the worse the prognosis in terms of their mental health and their cognitive performance, their educational achievement. And even in basic research, where when we give adolescent rats cannabis, we know that it tends to have much greater harms in their brains than in adult brains. But it's a double whammy in a way, because we find both in rats and probably in humans too that adolescents are more vulnerable to the rewarding effects of cannabis. So our adolescent rats don't mind a bit of cannabis, they quite like it, whereas the adult rats find it somewhat aversive. They don't really care for cannabis very much and will avoid places where they're given cannabis, where the adolescents don't seem to worry too much. And that certainly seems to be the case in humans as well. A lot of people have given up their cannabis use by the time they hit 30, whereas 16 to 18-year-olds seem to be amongst the main users of cannabis in our society. So something about the adolescent brain that's predisposed to like cannabis. It could be that they're more prepared to accept alternative experiences, that they're pre-programmed to seek out novelty and find radical changes less aversive than the adult sort of habit-based brain.
Well, my area of expertise is schizophrenia, and so the most important issue about cannabis is the relationship between cannabis and schizophrenia. Over the last 12 years, evidence has accumulated that use of cannabis increases the risk of schizophrenia, it probably doubles the risk, and heavy use of cannabis may increase the risk of developing schizophrenia up to 6 times. From my fairly narrow perspective as a schizophrenia researcher, the cannabis has been an extremely important development in schizophrenia research for the same reason that cannabis seems to increase the risk of schizophrenia. It's very clear, everyone accepts that there's a chemical brain disturbance in schizophrenia. Therefore, this might be providing us with a clue as to what this chemical disturbance is. I should say the cause of schizophrenia, the nature of brain disturbances, chemical or otherwise, remains largely unknown in schizophrenia.
Look, I think the most important thing that I'd like to say is that cannabis use in many Indigenous communities in Australia has been overlooked. Cannabis use, particularly in remote Indigenous communities, has become endemic. It's become endemic over quite a short history. From the mid to late 1990s, especially in the Northern Territory, where I documented this quite thoroughly, there was a rapid expansion of trafficking, so that communities that didn't have regular access to cannabis supplies in remote localities suddenly had that access. In Indigenous Australian communities, especially remote communities, we really don't need to do too much more research to document the problems. We don't need too much more cross-sectional research to document the issues. I think we've got a good grasp of those. We would, I think, be best to focus our preventive efforts on having research be a catalyst for trying to bring to bear appropriate programs to reduce cannabis use and some of the problems associated with it. The programs need to be coordinated and targeted. There needs to be a coordinated approach between police and researchers and community agencies and the various stakeholders and health service providers in particular and other service providers in communities with a complete multiple component focus on cannabis use issues. It's challenging, but it's rewarding too, because there's such a high need and there's such a dearth of services and opportunities. Basically anything you do can make a difference. What we need to do is be smart about sustaining those changes if we can get them focused.
I think the biggest area that's really emerged in the whole area of cannabis research has been the change of the views of cannabis over the last 15 years. When I began doing research into cannabis about 15 years ago, everyone believed that this was a relatively benign drug, there wasn't much harm, and the biggest risk of cannabis was the risk of arrest. Now you come to the conference and there are people talking about effects on psychosis, effects on education, effects on crime, effects on driving, and it's recognised now that this is not a simply safe drug. It does have harms. And another trend that has emerged particularly is the higher risk in adolescent populations. And so the big change that I've seen is an emergence of an evidence-based view of cannabis rather than an opinion-based view. And we've reached the age of enlightenment where the evidence is now outrunning the opinion. I think we now have enough understanding of the risks. You know, we can go on and on documenting risk with animal studies, human studies, population studies. What we need now to do is to move forward to interventions and to science-based approaches to interventions by developing effective treatments and approaches, by doing proper pilot studies, and most importantly in this area, randomised controlled trials. And I'm a very strong advocate for the view that there is no good reason that our public health interventions should be evaluated any less well than our medicines, and that there is a need to bring these methodologies, these rigorous methodologies, to evaluate effective treatments for preventing cannabis use and for the treatment of cannabis, heavy cannabis use and misuse.
I think the standout area is the importance around adolescent and early stage cannabis use before the age of 18. We've seen it from basic science on cannabinoids through to intervention and also right through to the public health side of things, where birth cohort studies are showing its effect on whether or not young people are able to complete high school and then in turn enter and complete university. So all of those strands are coming together to say adolescence is really where we need to be focusing our attention, from prevention programs in schools through to better interventions for those young people who are really entrenched in regular heavy use and experiencing problems in making change.